In this SY3 screencast, we're going to look at two very recent studies that might help to give you the edge in the SY3 examination. Now, in the screencast on examination skills, I talked about the main types of examination questions that appear on this particular paper. And the two studies that I'm going to focus on in this screencast would really help you to answer this question, or this type of question, which is by far the most frequently asked type of question on the SY3 paper about the distribution of power. And the first book that we're going to look at is this one called Affluence and Influence, written by Gilens, who's Professor of Politics at Princeton University in the US, and this book was published in 2012. Now, this book looks at the link between income inequality and political power, and especially the book looks at the extent to which government policy reflects the preferences of the public, and whether or not certain subgroups of the more and less well-off have more influence. Now, this book is a major piece of work because it collects a data set of over 2,000 survey questions that ask whether a proposed policy change by the US federal government is supported or opposed by the general public. And it covers the time period from the mid-1960s all the way up until 2006. And the book tries to look at how closely the popularity of a proposed policy change with the general public and subgroups within the public correlates with the likelihood of that policy actually being implemented. So this is a study that is clearly based on what Luke would call the first phase of power, decision making. Now, as one would expect, greater public support increased the likelihood of a proposed policy change actually being adopted by the government. And this is what we can see in this particular graph. So here we've got the percentage of the American public favouring a particular policy change, and here we've got the percentage chance of that change actually being adopted by the government. So we can see a clear correlation here. However, this correlation is perhaps not as strong as one would expect to find in a representative democracy like America. For example, where we have a proposed policy change that is supported by 75% of the public, so an overwhelming majority, we can see that there's still less than a 40% chance that that policy will actually be adopted by the government. So that's perhaps not what we would expect to find within a democracy. Now, when preferences across income groups diverge, in other words, when rich, middle income and poor Americans have different views on proposed policy changes, Gilens found that the association with policy outcomes persisted for the rich but disappeared for the middle class and the poor. And that's what's shown in these two graphs. So the red line that you can see on both of these graphs represents high-income Americans. And in this study, they're defined as the top 10% of income earners. And we can see that there's a strong correlation here that as more rich Americans favour a policy change, there is a much greater likelihood that that policy will be adopted by the government. But when we look at the line for low-income Americans, that's people in the bottom 10%, and also for people who are in the middle, we can see that it doesn't really matter whether or not there are relatively few people supporting a policy change or a lot of people. It really doesn't seem to have any significant influence on the likelihood of that policy being adopted. So these findings suggest that within America, political representation functions reasonably well for the rich, for the affluent, for the top 10%, but for both the middle class and the poor, their views are essentially unrepresented. In other words, they are unlikely to have a big influence on government policy unless they happen to share the preferences of the affluent Americans. And Gilens argues that if federal government policy more equally reflected the preferences of all Americans, we would see a more progressive tax structure where the rich paid more, we would see higher unemployment benefits, we would see stronger regulation of business and industry, and a more protectionist trade regime than we have at the moment within America. So this study is very significant for the work that we've done on theories of power. There's very little evidence in this book to support the pluralist perspective, this idea that the majority can influence the government. In fact, there's much more evidence within this book that America is largely controlled by financial elites and oligarchies. So to quote from Gilens, he says that in the United States, his findings indicate that the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes, and when a majority of citizens disagrees with the economic elites, they generally lose. Moreover, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favour policy change, they generally do not get it. So this study suggests that within America, democracy is not working at the moment, and power is concentrated disproportionately in the hands of the financial elites that perspectives like Marxism and power elite theory discuss. Another brand new book that would be really useful for questions about power is this book called Capital, written by the French economist Thomas Piketty. And in this book, Piketty argues that in a capitalist economy where the rate of return on capital outstrips the rate of economic growth, inherited wealth will always grow faster than earned wealth. So capital is defined by Piketty as anything that can be owned and that generates an income. And that can include things like housing, land, stocks and shares, and savings. And most capital is inherited. So because the value of things like stocks and shares and housing has tended to increase much more rapidly than wages, this leads to a situation where the wealthy get wealthier and wealthier and really begin to pull away from ordinary citizens. So in the US, for example, the richest 1% of the population have 40% of all of the wealth. And in the UK, in our country, the richest 1% have as much wealth as 60% of the population. And this wealth is then inherited by the children of the wealthy, by their grandchildren, and so on. For example, the 6 children of Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, now have as much wealth as the poorest 40% of people within America. In other words, they have become as wealthy as nearly half of the American population simply through inheritance. So the fact that rich kids can swan aimlessly from gap year to internship to a job at their father's bank, ministry or media company, whilst poor kids sweat in minimum wage jobs, is not an accident. It's the system working normally. The implication of Piketty's book is that unless we see the introduction of wealth taxes, or unless we have something like a war, wealth will continue to concentrate to levels that are incompatible with democracy. And the huge point of all of this is the constant accumulation of ever greater shares of wealth by an elite allows it to exert ever greater power on the political stage. So what we've got here with wealth and political power is a feedback loop. So the concentration of wealth in an elite gives that group disproportionate political influence. They can fund political campaigns, they can pay for professional lobbyists, they can own sections of the media, and all of these things gives the wealthy elite tremendous political influence. And then in turn they can use that political influence to make themselves even wealthier, because they can use political influence to stop things like a wealth tax from actually happening. So we've got a feedback loop here.